You step through towering palace doors into a chamber bathed in candlelight. The Spanish court watches you with careful eyes as you approach the throne. You've traveled months to reach this moment an audience with the most powerful monarch in Europe, the king who rules an empire spanning 4 continents. But as the figure on the throne turns toward you, your breath catches. His mouth hangs open, jaw jutting forward at an impossible angle. Saliva pools at the corners of his lips. When he tries to speak, only wet, garbled sounds emerge, something between words and drowning. His eyes hold yours with terrible awareness. He knows what you see. He knows the horror written across your face, and in that moment, you understand why his own people whisper that he's been touched by something beyond this world. Before we journey deeper into this tragedy, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze me that a story from 17th century Spain can connect us across continents and centuries through our shared fascination with the past. The year is 1665. The place is Madrid, heart of the Spanish Empire. The throne belongs to Charles II, a young king whose very existence defies natural law. Foreign ambassadors leave his presence shaken, their official dispatches carefully worded to avoid describing what they've witnessed. But in private letters home, they write of nightmares, of a sovereign who seems caught between human and something else entirely. The Venetian envoy describes him as a mouth that cannot close, hanging perpetually like a broken gate. A French diplomat writes that being in the king's presence feels like standing before a warning from God himself. But Charles II wasn't cursed by witchcraft or divine punishment, despite what his terrified subjects believed. He was cursed by something far more methodical and far more human. He was the final product of a genetic experiment conducted across 11 generations, an experiment in power and purity that created the very opposite of what it promised. This is the story of how Europe's greatest dynasty consumed itself from within, and how one deformed king became the living proof that nature cannot be defied without consequence. To understand Charles II, you must first understand the obsession that created him. For over 2 centuries, the Habsburg family had ruled half the known world. Their empire stretched from the snow-peaked mountains of Austria to the tropical islands of the Philippines. Silver flowed from American mines into Spanish coffers. Trade routes spanned oceans. The sun never set on Habsburg territories, and they intended to keep it that way forever. But there was a problem that haunted every Habsburg ruler. How do you keep an empire together when every generation threatens to divide it? How do you prevent wealth and power from scattering across Europe through marriage alliances with rival families? The Habsburgs found their answer in a strategy that seemed brilliant at the time. Marry only within the family. Keep the bloodline pure. Keep the power concentrated. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married each other. When those relationships became too distant, they found closer ones. Court advisors in the 16th century had already begun noticing warning signs. Physicians documented increasing rates of stillbirths in the royal nursery, children born with twisted limbs or clouded minds. The distinctive Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible that made eating difficult, was becoming more pronounced with each generation. Yet, every time someone suggested marrying outside the family, the response was the same. Absolutely not. Better a deformed Habsburg than a diluted one. Better a sick heir than sharing power with outsiders. By the time Charles II was conceived, his family tree had become something nightmarish. Where a normal person has 16 different great-great-grandparents, Charles had only 6. The same names appeared over and over in different positions on his genealogy. Anna of Austria was simultaneously his aunt, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Philip II appeared as his great-grandfather multiple times over. Modern geneticists who've studied his lineage calculated something that would have horrified even the Habsburgs had they understood it. Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient higher than if his parents had been full siblings. He wasn't the product of one generation's mistake. He was the accumulated genetic damage of centuries. concentrated into one catastrophically unlucky child. When Charles was born on November 6, 1661, the midwives fell silent. There should have been celebrations. This was the heir to the greatest empire on earth. Instead, there was horrified whispering. The infant's head was grotesquely oversized, his eyes set unnaturally far apart. His mouth hung open in a way that no amount of manipulation could close. Some of the attending women crossed themselves, convinced they were looking at something unnatural. Palace officials moved swiftly to contain the truth. Midwives were threatened with execution if they spoke of what they'd seen. Court physicians were ordered to declare the prince healthy and normal. Official announcements described Charles as a perfect child, blessed by God. But inside the palace walls, the reality was impossible to hide. The heir to the Spanish throne was so severely deformed that servants drew lots to avoid caring for him. Charles's early years read like a medical horror story. He couldn't lift his own head until age 6. Most babies achieve this milestone in their first months of life. Charles spent 6 years unable to support the weight of his own skull, his neck too weak to function properly. When he finally learned to walk at age 8, it was more of a stumbling lurch from furniture to furniture, his twisted spine giving him the posture of someone 3 times his age. His jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw taken to its ultimate extreme, projected so far forward that his upper and lower teeth never touched. Not even close. There was a gap wide enough to slide coins through even when he tried to close his mouth. His tongue, too large for his malformed mouth cavity, would slip backward when he lay down, blocking his airway. Wet nurses reported that the infant prince would stop breathing multiple times during sleep, turning blue before gasping back to life. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was that Charles seemed aware of his condition. Court records describe a child who would cry for hours without apparent cause, as though his very existence was painful. Palace servants reported hearing strange sounds from his chambers at night, not quite human crying, but something that made them hurry past his doors with prayers on their lips. When Charles turned 5, his first official portrait was commissioned. The painter, Juan Carreño de Miranda, arrived expecting to capture the charm of royal childhood. What he saw instead made him initially refuse the work. In private letters to his family, Miranda described the young prince as possessing an intelligence trapped in a vessel that seems designed to mock human form. Even the finished portrait, using every artistic technique available to flatter its subject, couldn't fully disguise what centuries of Habsburg marriages had created. As Charles grew older, though grew might be too generous a term for what happened to his body, his condition only worsened. By his teenage years, when most young men are reaching physical maturity, Charles looked like a diseased child stretched onto an adult frame. At 35 years old, he barely reached 5 feet tall. His limbs were stick-thin, his joints swollen and painful. His spine curved so severely that he appeared permanently hunched, as though carrying an invisible weight that only he could feel. Every meal became a grotesque ordeal. His malformed jaw made chewing impossible. The upper row of teeth sat completely behind the lower row, creating a mouth that simply didn't work. Palace kitchens had to prepare all his food as purees and liquids, everything mashed to the consistency of baby food. Even then, eating was a messy, laborious process. Food would leak from the corners of his permanently gaping mouth. Servants stood ready with cloths to constantly dab saliva from their king's chin. The psychological impact was devastating. Charles understood exactly how disgusting his eating habits appeared to others. Court documents show he often refused meals rather than endure the humiliation of eating in public. This malnutrition only compounded his already catastrophic health problems. He was constantly ill, constantly weak, trapped in a body that seemed determined to fail him in every possible way. Perhaps worse than the eating difficulties was his inability to speak clearly. The same jaw deformity that made swallowing impossible turned every attempt at speech into a garbled, wet mumbling. Even his own courtiers struggled to understand him. Foreign ambassadors needed interpreters not because of language barriers, but because they literally couldn't decipher what sounds were supposed to be words. Important matters of state had to be communicated through written messages because verbal communication was simply impossible. This created an unprecedented constitutional crisis. How could a king rule if he couldn't speak to his subjects? How could he issue commands, conduct diplomacy, or maintain the dignity of the crown when every word emerged as an incomprehensible gurgle? Palace scribes worked continuously, transcribing Charles's attempts at speech into written proclamations, though even they often had to guess at his meaning. In rare moments of clarity, Charles would write letters expressing his anguish at being trapped inside his own failing flesh. One surviving document, written in his shaky handwriting, contains a line that haunts historians. "I am a prisoner in my own body, and God has made me king of the greatest empire on earth as some terrible jest." But Charles's physical deformities were only part of his tragedy. The same genetic catastrophe that twisted his body had also affected his mind. He had the emotional regulation of a toddler trapped in an adult's body. Palace servants documented violent tantrums over minor inconveniences, screaming fits where Charles would throw objects and collapse on the floor, thrashing like a child denied a toy. These episodes would be followed by long periods of complete withdrawal, where he would sit motionless for hours, staring at nothing, utterly unresponsive to the world around him. He couldn't read until age 10, and even then struggled with basic comprehension. Royal tutors described teaching Charles as attempting to fill a vessel that has no bottom. Information seemed to pass through his mind without leaving any lasting impression. The intellectual capacity to rule an empire was simply not present, leaving actual governance to a rotating cast of advisors who used the king's name while he sat on his throne, drooling and confused. Yet the most urgent crisis wasn't Charles's ability to rule, it was his inability to produce an heir. The most powerful throne in Europe belonged to a man whose body couldn't fulfill the most basic requirement of kingship, continuing the dynasty. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political catastrophe that would reshape the entire continent. Charles married twice, both times with desperate hope that somehow nature might relent. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, arrived in Spain expecting to marry a king and found herself bound to what courtiers whispered was barely a man. The wedding night was reportedly a disaster. Palace servants later testified that Marie-Louise emerged from the royal bedchamber in tears, while Charles appeared confused and distressed, unable to understand what was expected of him. The same genetic mutations that had twisted his body had left Charles functionally impotent. Court physicians, in carefully worded reports, described his reproductive organs as infantile. Essentially, Charles had the sexual maturity of a prepubescent boy. But admitting this would have been politically catastrophic, so the Spanish court chose a different strategy: blame the woman. Marie-Louise was subjected to humiliating medical examinations and painful fertility treatments. She was forced to drink disgusting herbal concoctions, undergo invasive procedures, and endure constant scrutiny from a court desperately demanding she produce something her husband was biologically incapable of providing. Private letters she sent to her family in France paint a picture of absolute despair. She described being married to a ghost and living in a prison of expectations that can never be fulfilled. When Marie-Louise died mysteriously at age 26, many suspected suicide, though the official cause was listed as appendicitis. Charles's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg followed the same tragic pattern. Another woman blamed for Charles's genetic impossibility. Another decade of humiliating treatments and false hopes. Another failure written across 2 lives destroyed by Habsburg obsession. As medical science failed to explain or cure their king, the Spanish court turned to the supernatural. What followed were some of the most bizarre and disturbing episodes in royal history. Public exorcisms conducted on the king himself in the throne room of the palace. The church had found their explanation for Charles's condition. He was possessed by demons placed there through witchcraft directed against the Spanish crown. Father Antonio Alvarez Argüelles, the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles harbored multiple evil spirits that could only be expelled through aggressive spiritual warfare. These weren't quiet, private ceremonies. These were theatrical productions where nobles and foreign dignitaries were forced to watch their king writhing on the floor while priests screamed Latin incantations over his convulsing body. Each session would begin with Charles being forced to drink holy water mixed with ground relics of saints. He would immediately become violently ill, probably from drinking dirty water filled with bone fragments, which the priests interpreted as demons fighting the holy substances. Charles would vomit, shake uncontrollably, and sometimes lose consciousness, while Father Argüelles shouted that he could see devils leaving the king's body. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these sessions described them as more disturbing than any torture they'd seen in war. But the exorcisms didn't stop with Charles himself. In 1698, Father Argüelles became convinced the entire palace was cursed, leading to one of the strangest episodes in royal history. Servants were ordered to collect every item that might harbor witchcraft gifts from foreign courts, personal belongings of previous queens, even pieces of furniture. These objects were carried to the palace courtyard and burned in massive bonfires while priests chanted prayers. The smoke was so thick it could be seen from across Madrid, citizens gathering in the streets wondering if their palace was under attack. The most disturbing aspect was that Charles seemed to believe it was working. His limited mental capacity made him susceptible to suggestion, and when priests told him demons were being expelled, he would experience temporary relief from his constant pain. This created a horrific cycle where Charles would beg for more exorcisms whenever his symptoms worsened. Palace records show he underwent over 50 formal exorcism sessions during the last 5 years of his life, each one leaving him weaker and more mentally disturbed. Charles II died on November 1, 1700, 1 month before his 39th birthday. He had outlived all predictions, surviving decades longer than physicians thought possible. But his death triggered exactly what the Habsburgs had spent centuries trying to prevent, a succession crisis that tore Europe apart. With no heir, the Spanish throne became the most valuable prize on the continent, and every major power wanted to claim it. The War of Spanish Succession would rage for 13 years, killing hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The empire Charles inherited, the greatest territorial holding in European history, was carved up and distributed among rival powers. The Habsburg line in Spain ended exactly where it had always been heading, in genetic collapse and dynastic extinction. When Charles's body was autopsied, physicians discovered the full extent of what Habsburg marriages had created. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were putrid. His single testicle was completely black. The report concluded that Charles's body did not contain a single drop of blood, likely referring to the extreme anemia caused by his genetic disorders. He was, in the most literal sense, a man whose body had been dead for years, while his consciousness remained trapped inside. The portraits of Charles II still hang in Madrid's museums, carefully positioned among images of his healthier ancestors. Visitors walk past them quickly, uncomfortable with the face staring back at them, the face that shows exactly what happens when human beings believe they can override natural law through sheer will and political calculation. That protruding jaw, those vacant eyes, that permanently open mouth, these weren't just unfortunate features. They were nature's verdict on centuries of genetic manipulation. The Habsburgs believed their bloodline was superior, but centuries of inbreeding produced Charles II, the weakest, sickest, and last of their line. Their quest for genetic purity created not perfection, but collapse. A king who could barely speak, eat, or reproduce. Nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, Charles embodied the price of arrogance, proof that power cannot defy biology. His deformed body was nature's verdict on a dynasty that chose purity over survival. When he died heirless, The Habsburg experiment ended, leaving a final warning. Some boundaries exist for a reason, and crossing them exacts a terrible price.